Okay, so this is part 3 of the Antinous portrait. And in this lesson, we're going to be having a look at how we can draw those hair curls, because those are some very complicated forms to draw. And so what I want to do is I would like to walk you through the process of how I actually approach drawing some of those complicated forms, because it is something that I think a lot of new students tend to struggle with. And I certainly used to struggle with drawing those hair curls as well. The first time I used to draw these kind of portraits, they didn't turn out very good at all. The face was fine, but it was the hair curls that I really struggled with initially, because there's so much detail involved in constructing those. And what you need to understand is that there's kind of like there's a hierarchy of details involved in constructing it. You can't go straight for the most minuscule details. There is a process that you have to follow if you're going to draw those forms successfully. So at this point of the drawing, you can see that I'm just shading away at the face. I'm just getting that base layer of tone in there, and I'm just using hatching strokes. I'm not really smudging my marks or anything like that. I just allow those tones to darken very gradually, just with each hatching stroke. So I'm shading in the shades and the cast shadows as well, and I'm just using pretty much a uniform tone for all of it. But if you are going to start shading during this part, definitely keep your tones very, very light. They should be just a step darker than white, really. So really just a single layer of hatching. But don't get too caught up. If you are going to shade the face like I am, don't get too caught up into it, because we still haven't finished the linear drawing. We've still got to draw all of those really complicated hair curls. But I do like to sometimes shade a little bit earlier, because by toning the face, you can really see if the proportions are looking good. Sometimes whenever we use line drawing, it can sometimes look a little bit funny, because obviously human beings we don't see the world, we don't perceive the world around us in terms of line. We see it in light and shade, okay? So whenever we look at an object in front of us, we immediately notice the light shapes and the shadow shapes. So by doing a very light base layer of toning, it kind of helps us to check whether our proportions are looking good. And it also helps us to check to see if the drawing is basically just turning out the way we intend it to. So adding in those shadow shapes can definitely help you establish and correct some of those proportional things. But again, don't get too carried away in the early stages. If you are going to start toning during this stage, keep your strokes very, very, very light. And in that way, you can erase those tones much more easily. If you go too dark, it's going to be very, very difficult to shift and change some of those proportions. But yeah, I like to really get some of that shading, especially around the eyes, because the eyes are probably the trickiest part of the portrait to draw. A lot of people tend to struggle with drawing eyes. They're never easy to draw. So by getting some of those shadow shapes in there early on in the drawing, that's really a good way to see if the drawing is turning out the way you want it to. Okay, so I've toned around the eye sockets and, some of the cast shadows on the eyeballs, and I think I'm just going to leave the toning there for now. I think I got a little bit carried away. But here, I'm actually jumping into the meat of the lesson now. So we're actually drawing in those hair curls. And you'll notice it's quite a similar process to actually drawing the head. I'm not going straight for the details. I'm actually breaking up those hair curls into their individual shapes. Okay? And that's a bit easier said than done because it's such an abstract form. The shapes that you see might be slightly different to the shapes that I see. But again, rather than going for all of those detailed shadow shapes or anything like that, I'm just trying to simplify those forms. And again, similar to the earlier stages in the drawing, I'm jumping around in different parts of the drawing, okay? So again, I'm never getting tunnel visioned into one particular area. I work on the fringe, I go to the side of the head, now I've jumped to the other side of the head, okay? So you have to draw everything, you have to see everything as a whole, okay? You can't just start working from a detail and expand that way. Some artists do that, but I think for beginners or people who are just learning this academic drawing, you have to train your brain to see things as a whole. Because again, if you do get tunnel visioned into a particular area, that's not going to be good for the drawing and you're going to lose all sense of proportion. Now, I'm not being a slave to the proportions in my reference at this point. You know, the hair curls can, they don't have to be perfectly proportionate. You just want to get the general idea down, okay? Hair is something that actually moves in real life. So when you're drawing these sculptures, you don't have to measure every single hair curl. Just get the basics down, okay? That's all you have to do. They are very abstract forms, and if you draw them slightly differently, then it's not going to make much of a difference to the overall finish of the portrait. But you do want to get them generally correct, okay? But again, the size and the proportions and the exact placement of each hair curl is not as important as how you construct them three-dimensionally, okay? And that's a very different thing. So when it comes to constructing the hair curls, you're going to have to pay attention to the shades, and you're also going to have to pay attention to those cast shadows, and you're going to have to learn how to differentiate between the two, because the shades and the shadows are going to tell you exactly what that form is. And you'll notice that in the finished drawing, there's a lot of detail in those hair curls, and they have a very three-dimensional form. Okay, there's planes that are in light, and then there's planes where they turn into shadow. And depicting those correctly and making them look three-dimensional is what's going to make them look a lot more real and a lot more finished. But it's something that is very, very much easier said than done. But just as we constructed the face, we do the exact same process for drawing the hair, right? So you don't just start drawing the shades and the cast shadows just yet. You have to actually draw the forms first. So at this point, don't concern yourself with the shadow shapes initially. Just do exactly as I'm doing right now, just drawing the outline of each of those curls. And some of those outlines I know are a little bit ambiguous. You can see where I'm drawing now. I'm trying to estimate what some of those shapes might be in the shadow shapes there, but in the reference, they are not exactly that clear. So I don't go into too much detail in those shadow shapes. I just kind of sketch what I see and then I leave it at that. And you can see I'm also drawing on the other side of the hair there. So at this point, I'm just kind of outlining, just darkening some of the outlines, completing and just refining some of the outlines that I've got, making sure that the shapes look fairly good. And I'm just kind of refining some of those silhouettes of those shapes. And I'm darkening the lines that tend to come into contact with a shadow. So with the silhouette of the hair curls completed, I'm now going to go into greater detail. And you can sketch the shadow shapes during this stage, but what I'm actually doing is I'm trying to think about some of the plane changes. I'm using the shadow shapes in the reference as a guide to help me design some of these plane changes. But it's important to know that I'm not just copying the shadow shapes that I see. I'm actually having a look at some of the details in those hair curls and trying to figure out what those plane changes might actually be. And of course, the shadow shapes can definitely help you do that. But again, I don't really want to rely on those. I really want to try and figure out exactly what that three-dimensional form is. You'll notice that these hair curls, they tend to have like a step formation, you know, like some of the curls on the hair kind of look like steps where, you know, there's like a flat plane and then there's a vertical plane and then it gets flat again. And those are the kind of forms that you want to be paying attention to, because if you can draw those well, then you'll have a much, much better result. I'm kind of darkening those lines that are in the foreground. I'm also using dark lines for any creases in the hair shapes that tend to come into contact with the shadow shapes. So you can see I'm just kind of drawing that plane on the top curl there. And then here's another plane that I'm sketching, which happens to fall in the shadow. It's quite a tricky thing to learn how to do properly. Again, this is more, it's a combination of knowledge, but also intuition. And I think it's intuition that is something that I can't really teach you. It really only does come from experience. So the more you're practicing this way of drawing, the better you're going to get at it. I can teach you how I do it and I can show you how I do it, but it's really up to you guys watching these video lessons to put the time in, because if you don't, then you don't actually get any kind of result. But the process, again, is largely the same. You're starting from the largest shapes, you're breaking them down into smaller shapes, and then you're thinking about those more refined details, you know, the plane changes. You start actually constructing these forms. So that's the general process. You don't want to dive straight into a detail because that's quite detrimental to the drawing. It'll certainly be detrimental to the proportions because you'll lose control of it all. So at this point, I've actually just taken the eraser and I've just lightened some of the line work. I've lightened some of the shading as well because I felt like it was just a little bit too dark at this stage of the drawing. I do want to kind of keep everything a little bit lighter. But now that I've sketched in some of those plane changes and I've got the outline to the curls, you can see now that in this stage, I'm actually coming in and I'm drawing those cast shadow shapes. So now a cast shadow is a shadow that falls from another object. So, and these hair curls that we're drawing, they cast shadows onto each other. And that's the part that I'm doing right now. And I am using a slightly darker line to indicate this. Again, line quality and line control is very important at all stages of the drawing because they help to demystify some of those forms for you. If all of your lines are the same weight, then it can be very confusing for you to know exactly what's going on, especially when you start toning the drawing. Because what inevitably happens is you tend to confuse those shadow shapes with each other. Remember that a cast shadow is different from a shade, okay? And a core shadow is different from ambient light, and so on and so forth. And so establishing a hierarchy in your line work is going to be very important for you to keep in control of this drawing. So the cast shadow shapes, I'm drawing with a darker line. And some of those planes that are in shadow or are turning into shade, I might mark those with a dark line as well. Again, a lot of these concepts are easier said than done. And when it comes to line work, experience is the best teacher. You know, again, I can teach you all the theory, I can explain to you how exactly I do it, but unless you're actually drawing it, then you're not really going to learn anything. So in this case, it might be a good idea to watch the video lesson and just kind of draw along with me. I also find doing frequent quick sketching, like just line drawings, can really help you improve on your line quality quite quickly, actually. So not every drawing that you draw has to be rendered, okay? You don't have to add tone into all of your drawings. I find doing a lot of nice line drawings and focusing on the quality of that line is a great way to improve not just your line quality, but just your drawings in general. Lines are a very good, they're very good at communicating form when they're drawn well. But I do find that they are the hardest thing to learn. It took me years to be able to draw lines that actually look good. So, you know, it's a bit of a learning process. But once you get it, then it's good. It's pretty much smooth sailing. So now that I've indicated a few of those plane changes, I'm actually going to start going in and just hatching those shades and shadows very, very lightly. You have to remember at all times that the cast shadows should be slightly darker than the shades. Okay, so in a lot of art academies, we're taught to simplify the shadow shapes, that they should actually merge together and that they should be very, very similar in tone to the point where they're all just kind of blended in together. I actually disagree with that philosophy. I think if you really want this portrait to jump out, if you really want to make it look three-dimensional, even if it still looks like a sketch, but if you want that three-dimensional effect, you have to make the effort in separating those shadow shapes, okay? So rather than downplaying them, you might want to actually consider just slightly boosting that contrast between the different tones in shadows, okay? So cast shadows, render those a little bit darker. Make sure that the core shadows are also a little bit darker. So remember that the core shadow is the turning point from light to shade, okay? The core shadow rests on that border. So you can actually have a look at the finished drawing onto the right of the screen and to find all of these shadow shapes, and you can see how I've rendered them. But yeah, don't downplay the shadow shapes. Try to actually get a bit of contrast in there, because I find it's the shadow shapes that do most of the work when getting objects to look three-dimensional. In fact, I actually tend to flatten the light shapes, if anything. I do render along the border, along the core shadow. I get those halftones in there. But you'll notice that in the finished portrait, the light tones are very similar in tone. They're not varied at all. It's actually the shadow shapes that have got most of the variation of tones in there. And I think that's kind of what makes this sort of drawing look really cool. It's one of the reasons that I really like academic drawing, because they seem to take the exact opposite approach to most of the Western academies. And, you know, sure enough, like the finished portrait may not look photorealistic, but at this point, I want to remind you that photorealism is not the goal. Good design, a good eye for proportion, clean line work, these things are the goal of any drawing. And a drawing should not look like a photograph. It should look like a drawing, okay? Because personally, I believe drawings and paintings are actually a lot more beautiful than photography. There's just something about that handcrafted touch which is really quite irreplaceable. So again, we're not looking to make something photorealistic. We want it to be believable, and we want it to look three-dimensional, because that's what makes it look believable. But the goal is to draw a good drawing, not to make something that looks flat and photographic, you know. So don't overblend. Make sure that those pencil strokes are visible. And again, the ultimate goal is to be able to draw from imagination, and copying from photos, whether you're using a grid or you're trying to make something look photorealistic, that actually does not teach you how to draw from imagination. What does teach you how to draw from imagination is having a crystal clear understanding of planes, anatomy, and how light and shadow actually works in a three-dimensional space, okay? When you understand something, then you can do it from your head. But if you're simply copying what you see and you're just mindlessly copying, that does not teach you how to draw from imagination. You won't really get any kind of meaningful results from that. And I think that's where a lot of artists tend to get frustrated, because they spent a long time honing their skills copying from photos, but they still can't draw the things that they really would like to draw. So even though we are working from a reference, we always work in this process, okay? Because this process that I'm working in, you can apply it to drawing from imagination. There's a reason we draw this way. We're not doing it for no reason. There's a very good reason why we do follow this process. It's because it allows us to actually slowly build and construct all of these complicated forms and all the complicated anatomy involved in it. And it actually makes us think three-dimensionally, okay? Like, we're not mindlessly copying what's in front of us. We're actually thinking about the construction. We're thinking about the changes of those planes and how they change depending on the light source. So at this point, there's about 10 minutes or maybe less than 10 minutes left in this video. But this is basically the process. It's just kind of going over what you've already drawn, separating those cast shadow shapes, separating those core shadows from the reflected light, and so on and so forth. So it's quite a repetitive process at this point. So at this point, I will let the rest of the video play out and you can watch what I do. That part of the hair, actually, I will say quickly, that's basically all in shadow. You don't have to render those shadows in their entirety just yet. What you really want to do is you want to stay focused on the border between light and dark. That's where most of your attention should go. And that's why I've rendered the eyes, and that's why I've rendered the curls above the eyes. Anything else that's traveling away from that, I put less attention to. I might put a few strokes in there just to kind of give it a light tone, like I did with the side of the head. But at this stage of the drawing, try to kind of focus on all of the borders between light and shadow and get a bit more contrast happening in those areas. Because again, that's how the portrait tends to emerge from the white of the paper. It's you're just gradually darkening the tones until the face comes forward. But that side of the hair and the side of the neck, that's all in shadow. You don't have to obsess over that. Again, you can put a few hatching strokes along like the border of light and shadow on the face and then let them filter out that way. But at this stage of the drawing, try to keep your focus on where all that detail is, which is the border between the light and the shadow on the hair curls, around the eyes, around the forehead. That's pretty much what I did, because I figured that's where a lot of those detailed shapes are, and those are the kind of shapes that's really going to draw the viewer's attention. So most of my attention is focused on that part of the portrait.